The garden party disrupted. The late afternoon sun was gentle but insistent, draping the quaint village of Little Hemsby in a warm, golden light. At St. Martin's Rectory, the annual summer garden party was in full swing, a cherished tradition that marked the height of the social calendar for this otherwise quiet corner of the English countryside. The garden itself was a model of English horticultural pride. Beds of roses, foxgloves, and delphiniums formed bursts of color among the neatly clipped hedges and the freshly mown lawn. Overhead, pastel bunting fluttered lazily from tree to tree, while the faint scent of honeysuckle mingled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed tea. Chapter 1. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably beneath a blooming rose arbor, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, a faint touch of rouge bringing a healthy glow to her otherwise serene face. Despite her unassuming demeanor, her pale blue eyes were alert and inquisitive, quietly taking in every detail of the gathering. She observed the villagers with her customary quiet amusement. The ladies in their pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats, the gentlemen in their summer suits and straw boaters, all gathered to exchange pleasantries and gossip over cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge cake. It was the sort of event that gave Miss Marple ample opportunity to study the nuances of human nature, which she found infinitely more fascinating than any crossword or knitting pattern. "The rector's really outdone himself this year," remarked Mrs. Clara Peck, the village baker's wife, padding over in her sensible shoes and floral dress, a small smile creasing the corners of her mouth. Her gaze flicked admiringly toward the long table groaning under the weight of delicacies. "Look at the size of that cake. Surely enough to feed the whole county." Miss Marple smiled politely, placing a stitch with gentle precision. "Indeed, Mrs. Peck. Although I dare say it will be swiftly consumed by the time the party ends." Her eyes twinkled with subtle amusement. As Mrs. Peck moved on to greet a neighbor, Miss Marple's attention drifted toward a quiet corner where a small group of younger women were gathered. They whispered behind lace fans, their voices hushed yet urgent, stealing curious glances at a tall, dark-haired man standing apart from the crowd. This was Mr. Edmund Carver, the new vicar's assistant, whose arrival a few months ago had been the subject of much speculation. Little was known about him, save for his reserved nature and meticulous manners. Miss Marple noted his slightly uneasy posture, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the gathering with a measured gaze. His presence was a quiet intrigue in the village's otherwise predictable social tapestry. Nearby, the mayor, Mr. Harold Grayson, was conducting his customary rounds, shaking hands and complimenting the hosts with an enthusiasm that bordered on theatrical. His ruddy complexion glowed beneath the brim of his hat, and his white teeth flashed in an overeager smile. "Wonderful turnout, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" he said as he approached, wiping a bead of perspiration from his brow with a handkerchief embroidered with the village crest. "The whole village seems to have turned out to celebrate. This is the sort of occasion that keeps Little Hemsby thriving." Miss Marple nodded politely, replying, "It is a fine gathering indeed, Mr. Grayson. And such events often reveal more than just the surface cheer." The mayor chuckled nervously. "I'm sure you mean nothing but good, my dear. The only secrets around here are in the church crypt, and even those are well kept." At that moment, a sudden shriek pierced the warm afternoon air, a sound so unexpected and sharp that it instantly shattered the convivial atmosphere. The chatter fell to stunned silence as all heads turned toward the source, the edge of the churchyard, just beyond the neatly trimmed hedgerow. The shriek came again, a high-pitched, trembling cry that sent a ripple of alarm through the crowd. Women clutched their handbags tighter, children looked up from their games with wide eyes, men exchanged anxious glances. "Someone quick!" called a young woman, her voice shaky. "It's Mrs. Penrose. She's fallen. I think she's hurt." Without hesitation, a cluster of villagers hurried toward the churchyard gate, parting the throng with urgency. Miss Marple rose smoothly to her feet, folding her knitting and tucking it carefully into her reticule. Her pace was measured, thoughtful, not hurried, but filled with the quiet determination that came from a lifetime of observing human nature's myriad expressions. As she approached, she took note of the shifting expressions around her. Fear, shock, confusion, all masked thinly by the veneer of polite concern. It was a tableau she had seen many times before, and the small details did not escape her. The man stepping forward to assist was Dr. Thomas Avery, the village physician, his usually composed face etched with concern. The small crowd had gathered tightly now, forming a circle around a frail figure lying on the cold grass. The woman, Mrs. Gladys Penrose, was a familiar face in the village, elderly, slight, with a reputation for being sharp-tongued but kind-hearted beneath it all. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her face was pale, almost waxen in the fading light. "Stand back, please," Dr. Avery urged firmly, kneeling beside her. He checked for a pulse, his fingers steady but his eyes troubled. She's not breathing." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Miss Marple moved closer, kneeling gently by the woman's side. She took Gladys Penrose's cold hand in hers, feeling the stillness beneath her touch. There were no visible injuries, no sign of a fall or attack. The peaceful garden party had turned into a scene of sudden and inexplicable tragedy. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple caught the anxious glance of Edmund Carver, the vicar's assistant, standing awkwardly near the church door. He looked every bit as surprised and confused as the rest of the village. "Has anyone seen anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of inquiry. A few villagers murmured among themselves. "No, nothing out of the ordinary until just now," said Mrs. Peck, her brow furrowed. "Gladys was walking through the churchyard to fetch some water from the well. She said she felt a bit faint earlier." "She was complaining about her heart, wasn't she?" added Mr. Grayson, stepping forward, trying to impose order. "Maybe it was a natural cause." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully but said nothing further. She had learned that the first impressions of a death were often deceptive, and that the truth lay buried beneath layers of human behavior and hidden motives. As Dr. Avery stood, his face grave, he addressed the crowd. "I'm afraid Mrs. Penrose is dead. We must notify the police." The murmurs rippled through the villagers, some expressing disbelief, others quietly whispering speculation. The party had been transformed from a light-hearted social event to a somber gathering of uneasy hearts. Miss Marple stood quietly apart, watching the faces around her. In the flickering shadows cast by the evening sun, she sensed that beneath the calm surface of Little Hemsby, deeper currents stirred, currents that might explain the sudden death of one of its own. Her mind began to assemble the pieces, as it always did, not with the blunt force of accusation, but with the delicate touch of insight. She would listen, observe, and wait. The secrets of St. Martin's Church and the village beyond were not so easily laid to rest. The garden party at St. Martin's Rectory had dissolved into a murmur of hushed conversations and sideways glances. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows over the village of Little Hemsby, as the villagers slowly dispersed, their cheerful faces replaced by a mixture of shock, curiosity, and speculation. Miss Marple remained seated on a low stone bench near the rose arbor where she had been moments before, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She allowed the noise of the crowd to swirl around her without engagement, her pale eyes narrowing slightly as she observed. It was well known to her that in small villages such as this, a sudden death was rarely accepted at face value. The whispers and rumors that would soon spread were part of a delicate social dance, where facts mingled freely with conjecture, and everyone had an opinion, no matter how flawed. From her vantage point, Miss Marple noticed the first clusters of conversation taking shape like ripples on a still pond. "Did you see how she just dropped?" a voice said sharply. "No sign of illness." "It's not natural." "That's nonsense," another replied. Gladys Penrose was as frail as a winter twig. It could have been her heart, or maybe she tripped. "Tripped?" scoffed a third. "I didn't see any marks on her." "No one did." "Something's off." The speakers were members of the younger generation, their faces flushed with the adrenaline of sudden drama. Their voices betrayed a hunger for mystery that the quiet village rarely provided. Nearby, a group of older ladies clustered together, murmuring in low tones. Mrs. Clara Peck, the baker's wife, who had greeted Miss Marple earlier, seemed particularly distressed. Her eyes flicked toward the church crypt, its heavy iron door barely visible behind a veil of ivy. "I can't help but think of the old tales," she whispered to her companion, Mrs. Edith Hall. "The legends of the secret beneath the church. Could it be connected somehow?" Mrs. Hall clutched her handbag tighter, eyes wide. "Nonsense, Claire. Those stories are just stories. People have been whispering about them for generations. Nothing ever comes of it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the crypt entrance. She had heard the stories herself, fragments of long-buried village secrets whispered in passing, never fully explained. But she knew better than to dismiss such things outright. Often, the truth hid in those half-forgotten tales. As the sun lowered further, the village doctor, Dr. Avery, was speaking quietly to the local constable, Inspector Harold Finch. The inspector's face was grave but controlled, betraying none of the rush of questions running through his mind. "We must treat this as a sudden death, but I want a full examination," Finch said, his tone firm. "I don't want any unnecessary panic, but if there's even a hint of foul play—" "Of course, Inspector," Avery interrupted. "I'll do my best. The family should be notified discreetly. No need to alarm the whole village." Miss Marple stepped forward then, her voice gentle but carrying quiet authority. "Inspector Finch, may I have a word?" The inspector turned, nodding politely. He was a younger man, perhaps in his early 40s, with a neat mustache and a well-pressed uniform. "Certainly, Miss Marple. I gather you were at the party?" "Yes. I was nearby when Mrs. Penrose collapsed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "If I may, there are always subtleties in such events that might escape the first glance. It might be worth speaking to the villagers more extensively before drawing conclusions." Finch's eyes flickered with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "I appreciate your interest, Miss Marple. The village tends to have its share of secrets, though I'm usually relying on facts, not folklore." "And rightly so," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "But sometimes, the truth is woven in between." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of the new vicar, Reverend Thomas Harcourt. His face was pale, and his eyes dark with concern. "I have just spoken with Mrs. Penrose's niece," he said quietly. "They were very close. She's devastated." Miss Marple inclined her head in sympathy. "Yes, a sad blow for a woman so well known here." The Reverend's gaze drifted toward the crypt. "It is a somber day for St. Martin's indeed." As the village began to settle, Miss Marple made her way to the rectory's veranda, where several of the elder villagers had gathered. Among them was Mrs. Agnes Mallory, a sharp-witted widow who had known everyone in Little Hemsby for decades. "Jane," Mrs. Mallory greeted her with a nod. "Quite the shock today." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "Did Mrs. Penrose have any known ailments, Agnes?" "Not beyond the usual for her age," the widow replied, folding her hands. "She was feisty, mind you, and kept to herself mostly, but no one expected this." "Do you know if she had any disputes recently?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Mallory considered for a moment. There were a few grumbles over the church renovations. Gladys was rather outspoken against them. Said they were desecrating the old stones. Some felt she was a bit of a nuisance on the matter. Miss Marple made a mental note. Small resentments often festered beneath village civility. Nearby, a younger man, Mr. Leonard Sims, the local schoolteacher, joined the conversation. His nervous energy was palpable as he leaned forward. "I overheard that Gladys had been arguing with one of the new parish council members," he said quietly. "A Mr. Peters. Something about the land next to the churchyard. They say it might be sold." Mrs. Mallory raised an eyebrow. "That would certainly ruffle feathers. That patch of land has been in dispute for years." Miss Marple listened carefully, piecing together a tapestry of village tensions woven into the fabric of this tragedy. As evening fell, the village pub, the King's Arms, became the natural gathering point. The atmosphere was thick with whispered theories and uneasy glances. "I don't buy this sudden death nonsense," declared Mr. George Handley, the local carpenter. "Gladys was strong as a horse for a woman her age." "Aye," agreed Mrs. Edith Hall, who had followed the party there. "Something doesn't sit right." The vicar's assistant, Edmund Carver, arrived shortly, greeted with polite nods but watched closely by many. His reserved nature made him a subject of suspicion, though there was little known about him beyond the fact that he kept to himself. Miss Marple took a quiet seat near the fire, observing the gathering with careful eyes. She caught snippets of conversation about the church crypt, about land disputes, about past grievances that had never quite healed. It was clear that the village was more complicated than it appeared on the surface, a place where history and personal grudges simmered just beneath the polite smiles. Later that night, as Miss Marple prepared to retire to her modest cottage on the village edge, she paused to reflect on what she had seen and heard. The death of Mrs. Penrose was no simple matter, and she sensed the threads of a hidden story beginning to unravel. There would be questions to ask, secrets to uncover, and subtle signs to interpret. The shadow beneath St. Martin's Church was growing longer, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve and keen insight, was ready to trace it to its source. Chapter 2. Early Investigation. The next morning dawned cool and gray, a thin mist settling over Little Hemsby as if the village itself were shrouded in uncertainty. St. Martin's Church stood solemn and silent against the muted sky, its ancient stones heavy with centuries of stories, both told and untold. Miss Marple stepped out of her tidy cottage with her usual measured calm. She had spent the night turning over the fragments of the previous day's events in her mind, the sudden death of Mrs. Gladys Penrose, the murmured resentments, and the subtle tensions woven through the village. Today would be the beginning of her quiet investigation. The village was stirring as she walked toward the rectory. Shopkeepers unrolled their shutters, and early risers exchanged subdued greetings, still wrapped in the haze of the unsettling news. A few curious glances followed her, no doubt wondering what the astute spinster would make of the situation. Her first stop was the rectory garden, where a small group of villagers had gathered. Inspector Harold Finch was already there, clipboard in hand, directing his constables with a professional but respectful demeanor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Finch said, nodding as she approached. "I trust you're ready to assist." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I will observe what I can, Inspector. Perhaps we might begin with a look at the scene." Together they made their way toward the churchyard where Mrs. Penrose had been found. The dew-damp grass still bore the faint imprint of the gathered crowd's footsteps, and yellow tape marked off the area under the watchful eyes of two constables. The ancient church cast long shadows over the scene, the heavy stone buttresses stark against the soft greenery. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the crypt's iron door, slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. Inspector Finch gestured toward the spot where Mrs. Penrose had collapsed. "There's no visible sign of trauma," he said. "Dr. Avery's report suggests natural causes, but we're awaiting the full postmortem." "Were there any witnesses?" Miss Marple inquired. "Only a few who saw her walk through the churchyard," Finch replied. "She seemed steady, if a bit pale. No one saw her fall or heard anything suspicious." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Pale, you say? And she had been complaining of feeling faint." "According to Mrs. Peck, yes," the inspector confirmed. Miss Marple glanced around the churchyard, noting the small well near the side path, its wrought iron cover slightly rusted but secure. "Mrs. Penrose was said to have gone to fetch water from the well?" "Indeed," Finch said. "She was seen heading in that direction shortly before she collapsed." "The well's water is used occasionally for watering plants," Miss Marple mused. "I wonder if anyone else might have approached it recently." The inspector shrugged. "We'll ask around." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Harcourt. The young vicar looked more composed than the previous day, though a shadow of grief lingered in his eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said softly. "I hear the police are investigating. It is a difficult time for the parish." "It is, Reverend," she replied kindly. "If I might, I would like to speak with you about Mrs. Penrose. How well did you know her?" The Reverend hesitated before answering. She was a devoted member of the congregation, though somewhat set in her ways. She cared deeply for the church and was very protective of its history and traditions. Miss Marple nodded, sensing a subtle tension beneath his words. "And the recent renovations? Were they a source of concern for her?" Yes, Reverend Harcourt admitted. She opposed several of the changes, feeling they disturbed the sanctity of the place. Was there any conflict between her and others involved in the renovations? The Reverend's brow furrowed. Not overtly, but Gladys was not shy about voicing her displeasure. I suspect some in the parish council found her difficult. The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, the unspoken acknowledgement of underlying tensions filling the silence. Miss Marple thanked the Reverend and turned back toward the village center. The day stretched ahead, and there was much to discover. Her next visit was to the home of Mrs. Clara Peck, the baker's wife, who had been among the first to witness Mrs. Penrose's collapse. Clara's cottage was warm and fragrant with the scent of fresh bread. She greeted Miss Marple with a nervous smile, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Oh, Jane, it's such a terrible shock," Clara said, ushering her inside. Gladys was a fixture in this village, sharp-tongued, yes, but no one wished her harm. Miss Marple took a seat at the kitchen table, her gaze steady. Did Mrs. Penrose mention feeling unwell before the party? Yes, she said she'd been a bit dizzy lately, Clara explained. But she never seemed overly concerned. She was determined to come to the garden party despite it. Did she have any visitors recently? Family or otherwise? Clara shook her head slowly. Not that I know of, though there was some talk of her niece visiting soon. Did you notice any visitors or strangers around the churchyard recently? Miss Marple asked. Clara's brow creased. There was a man, a Mr. Peters, from the parish council, I think. He and Gladys had a few heated exchanges about the land beside the churchyard. Something about selling it. Miss Marple made a mental note. The land, the council, the heated disputes, it all began to form a pattern. Her next call was on Leonard Sims, the schoolteacher. His small cottage was cluttered with books and papers, evidence of a restless mind. Leonard welcomed her warmly. Miss Marple, I've been wondering how I might help. The village is unsettled, as you know. Thank you, Leonard, she said. I understand you overheard some of the arguments between Mrs. Penrose and Mr. Peters? Yes, Leonard confirmed, adjusting his spectacles. It seemed quite serious. Gladys was vehemently against selling the church land. She believed it held historical importance. And Mr. Peters? He seemed determined to push the sale through, despite opposition. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mysterious Mr. Peters. She had yet to meet him but resolved to seek him out soon. The afternoon passed in a series of quiet observations and gentle inquiries. Miss Marple visited the parish council office, where she found little cooperation but much guarded politeness. Mr. Peters himself was evasive, dismissing concerns with practiced ease. Back at the rectory, Miss Marple found Edmund Carver seated in the library, perusing an old leather-bound book. The vicar's assistant looked up with a faint smile. Miss Marple, he said, I hope I am not intruding. Not at all, she replied. I was hoping to speak with you. They talked about the church, its history, and the recent renovations. Edmund's calm demeanor contrasted with the unease Miss Marple had sensed in others. Yet, she detected a faint hesitation when the subject turned to Mrs. Penrose. Did you know Mrs. Penrose well? She asked gently. I respected her greatly, he answered. She was deeply rooted in the church's traditions. Her passing is a loss to us all. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his face, searching for something beneath the courteous exterior. As evening approached, she returned to her cottage with a mind full of impressions and unanswered questions. The village of Little Hemsby was a tapestry woven with secrets, old resentments, and unspoken fears. The death of Mrs. Gladys Penrose was no accident, she was certain, not in a place where history clung tightly to the stones of the church and shadows stretched long beneath St. Martin's eaves. Miss Marple settled by the fire, preparing to sift through the threads of the day's discoveries. Her gentle but unyielding curiosity would soon illuminate the darkest corners of the village. The morning after the post-mortem results were due was bright and crisp, the sunlight cutting through the lingering mist to reveal a village already restless with speculation. The usual quiet charm of Little Hemsby had been displaced by an undercurrent of suspicion that slipped quietly from conversation to conversation, coloring every glance and greeting. Miss Marple left her cottage with a small leather notebook tucked inside her handbag and a clear resolve to tread lightly. She knew all too well that in a village such as this, suspicion could fracture old friendships and cloud judgment as easily as fog obscured the country lanes. Her first visit was to the police station, a modest building nestled on the village's main street, where Inspector Finch awaited the post-mortem report and the information it might reveal. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Finch greeted her as she stepped into the modest office. "We've received the pathologist's preliminary report." "Do tell," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. The inspector unfolded the sheet with a sense of purpose. Cause of death was cardiac arrest, but the report indicates traces of a rare poison in the bloodstream, aconitine. It's a substance derived from the aconite plant, also known as wolfsbane. Highly toxic. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A poison? That changes the nature of things considerably." "It does," Finch agreed grimly. "This is no natural death." Miss Marple considered this quietly. "Do you have any suspects in mind?" Inspector Finch hesitated. "There's a handful of people with possible motives, though no direct evidence yet. We're questioning them carefully." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "May I accompany you? Sometimes a second pair of eyes and a different perspective help." "By all means," Finch said, leading the way. Their first stop was the home of Mr. Leonard Sims, the schoolteacher. Miss Marple had spoken with him before, and his nervous demeanor had been evident. Leonard greeted them with visible apprehension. "Inspector, Miss Marple. I hope you don't suspect me." Finch spoke kindly but firmly. "We must investigate everyone connected in any way." "Where were you last night?" "At home, grading papers," Leonard replied quickly. "Alone." Miss Marple studied him. "You mentioned a disagreement between Mrs. Penrose and Mr. Peters about the church land?" "Yes," Leonard nodded. "I only overheard bits of it, but Gladys was very opposed to selling it." "Did you notice any unusual behavior from either party?" Finch asked. Leonard shook his head. "No. Nothing out of the ordinary." Their next call was at the home of Mr. Thomas Peters, a stout man in his 50s and a member of the parish council. The house, a neat brick cottage, was immaculately kept, but Peters himself seemed unsettled. "Inspector, Miss Marple," Peters greeted with a curt nod. "What can I do for you?" "We're investigating the circumstances of Mrs. Penrose's death," Finch began. "You had some disagreements with her recently?" Peters sighed. "Yes, she was against the proposed sale of the church land. I maintain it's necessary for the village's financial health." "Did you have any altercations that might have gone further than disagreement?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Of course not." Peters snapped, but quickly masked his irritation. "I respected Mrs. Penrose, but she was stubborn." Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his hands as he spoke. "Were you aware that Mrs. Penrose had been poisoned?" Peters stiffened. "No. This is outrageous. I had nothing to do with it." Finch made a note. "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts last night?" "I was at the parish council meeting until late," Peters said. "Several witnesses can attest." Miss Marple glanced at Finch, sensing the inspector's cautious skepticism. They left Peters' cottage and continued to the home of Mrs. Clara Peck. The baker's wife was visibly upset but willing to answer questions. "Did Mrs. Penrose have any enemies?" Miss Marple asked. Clara shook her head. "No one outright enemies, but Gladys did rub some the wrong way with her opinions." "Such as?" Finch probed. "The land sale, of course. And she was quite vocal about the renovations, said they desecrated the church," Clara said. Miss Marple's mind drifted back to the crypt door she had noticed ajar days before. She made a mental note to ask about it. Next, they visited Edmund Carver, the vicar's assistant. His calm demeanor contrasted with the tension in the village. He greeted them in the vicarage sitting room, the windows overlooking the quiet churchyard. "Inspector Finch, Miss Marple," Edmund said with a polite nod. "How may I assist?" "We're investigating the poisoning of Mrs. Penrose," Finch said. "Where were you last evening?" "I was at the church, preparing for Sunday's service," Edmund answered. "Alone for most of the evening." Did you notice anything unusual? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. Edmund hesitated briefly. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Mrs. Penrose was a devoted member of the congregation. Her death is deeply saddening. Miss Marple noted the slight tightness around his eyes but said nothing further. Back at the station, Finch reviewed the facts with Miss Marple. We have motive in several quarters, he said. Mrs. Penrose's opposition to the land sale and renovations made her unpopular with certain members of the parish council. And yet, no clear opportunity for most, Miss Marple mused. The poison is rare and not easily acquired. Finch nodded. We're investigating where it could have come from. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's often in the smallest details that the truth hides. As the day wore on, whispers grew louder in Little Hemsby. The villagers began to look at one another with suspicion, old alliances fraying. The weight of secrets pressed heavier, and Miss Marple knew that the first suspects were but the beginning. Her own quiet inquiries would have to continue, subtle and patient, as she probed beneath the surface to uncover the true story hidden in the shadows of St. Martin's Church. Chapter 3. A Hidden Clue. The morning was unusually still, the village of Little Hemsby wrapped in a delicate quiet that seemed to hold its breath. The news of Mrs. Penrose's poisoning had settled into a wary tension, and the people moved through their routines as if shadowed by the unresolved mystery. Miss Marple, however, was anything but still. Her mind, always alert to the subtlest human nuances, was weaving together threads of information collected over the past days. She understood that the truth often lay hidden in the smallest details, those easily overlooked by others but illuminated by a patient and watchful eye. Her day began at the church itself, where Reverend Harcourt was overseeing preparations for a memorial service to be held for Mrs. Penrose the following Sunday. The church, with its high vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, was a place where time seemed to pause, and secrets could linger for decades. Miss Marple entered quietly, offering a gentle greeting to the Reverend, who was arranging fresh flowers near the altar. "Good morning, Reverend," she said softly. "I hope you do not mind if I take a closer look around the churchyard. There are matters I wish to consider." "Of course, Miss Marple," Harcourt replied. "The church and its grounds have always been a source of comfort to many here." Miss Marple wandered slowly through the shaded churchyard, noting the well-tended graves, the moss-covered stones, and the aged trees whose branches whispered in the breeze. Her gaze was drawn again to the crypt's iron door, still slightly ajar, its black metalwork worn and creaking faintly with the wind. She approached cautiously, peering into the dark entrance. It was a deep, narrow stairwell descending into cool shadows, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Something about the ajar door had unsettled her since she first saw it. Footsteps approached behind her. Edmund Carver, the vicar's assistant, appeared quietly. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low. "Is there something amiss?" "I was simply wondering why the crypt door was left open," she said. "It is unusual." Edmund hesitated briefly. "There has been some recent work in the crypt to preserve the structure and catalogue the memorials. The parish council approved it last month." "And Mrs. Penrose, was she involved?" Edmund nodded. "She was quite opposed to it. Felt it disturbed the sanctity of the place." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Did she have the opportunity to interfere with the work?" "I doubt it," Edmund answered. "She was mostly a vocal critic rather than a direct participant." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully as Edmund walked away. Her attention then turned to the well near the churchyard's edge, a simple stone structure with a wrought iron cover, which she had seen Mrs. Penrose approach on the day of her death. The cover was slightly askew, the lock loose and hanging open. Miss Marple crouched down, examining the metalwork with a practiced eye. She noticed something easily missed, a faint smear on the iron handle, subtle and almost invisible unless one looked closely. It was a dark, sticky residue, dried but unmistakable. As she examined the handle, a shadow fell across her. Inspector Finch, accompanied by a constable, approached. "Miss Marple," Finch said with a nod. "We were just coming to inspect the well. Reports have come in of strange activity around the churchyard late at night." Miss Marple pointed toward the iron handle. Look here. There's a residue. It's not fresh, but it's there. Finch knelt, inspecting the spot carefully. Could be something to do with the poison. Aconitine can be applied in small doses. Perhaps someone tampered with the water? An intriguing possibility, Miss Marple agreed. Did Mrs. Penrose drink from this well often? Not often, but she did mention fetching water here that afternoon, Finch replied. Miss Marple's gaze swept the area. A small patch of disturbed earth near the base of the well caught her attention. She knelt again, brushing away loose leaves to reveal a faint footprint, small and partially obscured, but distinct. Has anyone checked for footprints before now? She asked. Finch frowned. We have been focusing on the broader scene, but this was missed. We'll get a full search done immediately. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was the kind of detail that changed everything. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she carefully reviewed her notes. She pondered the well's iron handle, the residue, the loosened cover, and the faint footprint beside it. To her, these were not random accidents but deliberate acts designed to go unnoticed. The rare poison, aconitine, was a curious choice. It was difficult to obtain, not something one picked up casually at the local apothecary. Whoever had access to it was likely knowledgeable or connected to obscure sources. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the parish council's work in the crypt and the ongoing land dispute. The deeper she delved, the more she realized how tangled the village's affairs had become. That evening, she was joined by Mrs. Agnes Mallory, the sharp-witted widow who had proven a wellspring of insight. Jane, Mrs. Mallory began, sitting by the fire, I hear you found something at the well. Yes, Miss Marple replied. A residue on the iron handle and signs of disturbance nearby. It suggests to me that someone tampered with it. Whoever it was, they took great care to avoid detection, Mrs. Mallory observed. Little Hemsby is not used to such secrets. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Secrets often lie beneath the surface of the calmest villages. Mrs. Mallory nodded. And there are others, Jane, besides the parish council and the schoolteacher. I overheard talk of a stranger passing through recently, a botanist, some say. Could such a person be involved? Miss Marple considered this. The mention of a botanist was new, but it fit the profile of someone who might have access to rare poisons. Thank you, Agnes, she said. I will look into it. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Miss Marple reflected on the hidden clue she had uncovered. The well was a focal point, perhaps the key to unraveling the mystery. She knew that the true killer would not reveal themselves easily, but with patience and subtle observation, the shadow beneath St. Martin's Church would be brought to light. The days following the discovery of the poison and the well's suspicious residue brought a new tension to Little Hemsby. The village, usually steeped in gentle routine and neighborly smiles, had become a place where wary glances flickered in doorways and whispered conversations folded quickly when strangers approached. Miss Marple felt this shift keenly as she moved through the streets. The underlying resentments and grudges that had long simmered beneath the surface were beginning to bubble toward confrontation. Secrets long held quietly were now surfacing, and with them, new motives and suspicions. Her first visit that morning was to the home of Mrs. Clara Peck, the village baker's wife. Clara was a woman of strong opinions and a straightforward manner, though lately her cheerful disposition had been clouded by worry. Jane, Clara greeted her at the door, her brow creased with concern. It's hard to believe such darkness has come to our village. Miss Marple stepped inside the cozy kitchen, where the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the faint aroma of lavender from a vase on the windowsill. I imagine it has unsettled everyone, Miss Marple replied. Have you noticed any unusual behavior among the villagers? Clara shook her head slowly. Well, there's been whispers about the parish council, about the land sale, and, of course, about that man, Mr. Peters. Some say he's been acting strangely, keeping late hours and avoiding certain people. Have you seen or heard anything specific? Miss Marple inquired gently. Clara hesitated, then leaned in as if sharing a secret. There was a loud argument last week between Mr. Peters and Mrs. Penrose, right outside the church. Voices raised, words sharp. Some of us were frightened it would come to worse. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Conflict can reveal many things. Later, at the village post office, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Edith Hall, a widow known for her sharp tongue and keen observations. She was exchanging letters with a neighbor but paused to speak with Miss Marple. "Jane, I hope you're following the story closely," Edith said, her eyes gleaming with unspoken knowledge. "There are rumors about old grudges resurfacing. Apparently, Mrs. Penrose wasn't as liked as people pretended. Some say she had a falling out with several villagers over the years. Do you have examples?" Miss Marple asked. Edith lowered her voice. "There was that dispute over the allotments, where Gladys accused Mrs. Mallory of unfair dealings. Then, the recent church renovations, she was vocal against nearly everyone involved." Miss Marple took note, realizing the web of grievances was wider than she had first thought. By midday, she arranged to meet with Mrs. Agnes Mallory, the widow who was a repository of village history and subtle truths. Agnes welcomed her in a sitting room lined with old photographs and well-worn books. "Jane, secrets are the currency of a village like ours," Agnes said. "Gladys Penrose's death has peeled back a layer few cared to acknowledge." Miss Marple asked, "Have you heard anything new about those disputes?" Agnes sighed. "It's more than just disagreements. Some old wounds have reopened, and I fear this has gone beyond words." "Such as?" Agnes hesitated before speaking. "Years ago, there was a scandal involving the church's trust fund. Some funds went missing, never fully accounted for. Mrs. Penrose suspected Mr. Peters but lacked proof. She kept quiet mostly, but perhaps she planned to speak out." Miss Marple felt a chill. "That would certainly give motive." Agnes nodded. "And there is more. Last night, I heard voices raised near the rectory. Mr. Carver was arguing heatedly with Reverend Harcourt. Something about loyalty and trust." Curious, Miss Marple sought out Edmund Carver at the vicarage later that afternoon. She found him in the garden, pacing under the gray sky. "Edmund," she began gently, "I understand tensions have been high recently." He stopped, eyes troubled. "Yes, Miss Marple. The village's old secrets are hard to let go. The parish council's actions have divided many. Do you mind if I ask about your disagreement with the Reverend?" Edmund hesitated, then spoke softly. "Reverend Harcourt suspects me of meddling in council affairs. I only wish to protect the church's true interests." "And Mrs. Penrose?" "She was a staunch defender of tradition but had her own views. She questioned many of us." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Do you think her death is connected to these disputes?" "I fear so," Edmund admitted. "The village is not as peaceful as it seems." That evening, Miss Marple attended a parish council meeting called to address the village's unrest. The hall was crowded, voices raised in anger and frustration. Mr. Peters stood at the center, trying to quell the storm. "We must focus on what is best for Little Hemsby," he said firmly. "The sale of the church land is necessary for repairs and upkeep." Opposition voices shouted back, including Mrs. Mallory and others who echoed Mrs. Penrose's concerns. Amid the turmoil, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a brief exchange between Mr. Peters and a shadowy figure near the doorway, someone she had not seen before. As the meeting ended in chaos, she resolved to learn more about this mysterious visitor. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The village was a labyrinth of old wounds, hidden grudges, and fractured loyalties. Mrs. Penrose's death was not an isolated incident but a catalyst exposing the tangled roots beneath the village's calm surface. She knew that to unravel the mystery, she must carefully untangle these secrets, one by one, without stirring the village's delicate balance too violently. The shadow beneath St. Martin's Church was deepening, but so was Miss Marple's resolve to bring the truth to light. Chapter 4. Another twist. The village of Little Hemsby was awash with unease. The parish council meeting's acrimony had left fresh fissures in the community's fragile peace, and the residents spoke in hushed tones about the poisoning of Mrs. Penrose, the disputes over church land, and the shadowy figures lurking at the edges of their lives. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred by the unrest. To her, Such turbulence often signaled that a deeper truth was near the surface, waiting to be revealed. She began her day at the village shop, where a new piece of information had recently surfaced. Mrs. Peck, the baker's wife and an invaluable source of village gossip, greeted her with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Jane, you won't believe what I've heard," Clara whispered as she wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Last night, there was a break-in at the vicarage." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose in mild surprise. "A break-in, you say?" "Yes. But nothing was stolen, or so they say. The Reverend was away, but Mr. Carver found signs that someone had been searching the study." The news sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. The vicarage was a central place, a hub for the church's affairs and, possibly, a vault of secrets. She thanked Clara and made her way to the vicarage, finding Edmund Carver in the garden, his face pale and lined with worry. "Mr. Carver," Miss Marple greeted softly, "I heard about the break-in. Can you tell me what happened?" Edmund nodded slowly. It was a shock. The front door had been forced open, but nothing seemed missing. The study was turned upside down, drawers pulled out, papers scattered. Whoever did this was searching for something. "Anything taken?" Miss Marple asked. "Not that we could find. But some documents concerning the church's affairs, the land dispute, were among the scattered papers." Miss Marple considered the significance. A message, perhaps, or an attempt to intimidate? "Possibly," Edmund said. "The village is on edge." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Harcourt. The young vicar welcomed her into his study, the room still bearing signs of the intrusion. "Jane," he said quietly, "this break-in unsettles me more than I care to admit. I fear someone wants to suppress the truth about our parish." "Have you had any recent threats?" Miss Marple inquired. The Reverend shook his head. "Nothing overt, but tensions have been rising. Mrs. Penrose's death, the land sale, the council's disagreements, all of it a powder keg." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the room. "What is kept there?" she asked. Reverend Harcourt hesitated. "Records and correspondence related to the parish council, deeds, contracts. A tempting target for anyone wishing to hide something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed." Her next stop was the rectory garden, where Inspector Finch and several constables were interviewing villagers about the break-in. As she observed, she noticed Mr. Leonard Sims, the schoolteacher, lingering nearby with a restless expression. Miss Marple approached him. "Leonard, may I ask what you were doing near the vicarage last night?" He startled, then composed himself. "I was passing by on my way home. I didn't expect anyone to be there." "Did you see anyone suspicious?" "No, nothing," Leonard replied, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Miss Marple filed away the detail for later reflection. Later that evening, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the parish council, called to address the growing turmoil. The atmosphere was tense, voices rising in anger and accusation. Midway through, a sharp knock sounded at the door. The room fell silent as a young woman entered, her face flushed and eyes bright with urgency. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said breathlessly, "but I have information about the church land." All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward. "My name is Clara Jennings," she began. "I work in the nearby town, and recently I overheard a conversation at the market. Someone mentioned a secret about the land, something buried beneath the churchyard." A murmur swept through the room. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Clara, what exactly did you hear?" Clara swallowed nervously. "They spoke of old tunnels and hidden chambers under the church, used long ago for smuggling or secret meetings." Reverend Harcourt frowned. "These are old legends, nothing more." "But if it's true," Clara insisted, "it could explain why Mrs. Penrose was so protective of the church grounds." The council debated heatedly, some dismissing the tale, others unnerved by the possibility. As the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, pondering the implications. Later that night, a letter arrived at her cottage, delivered without a name. Inside was a folded sheet of parchment with a single line written in hurried script. "Look beneath the stones where the shadows gather." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This cryptic message was no coincidence. The next morning, she returned to the churchyard, her gaze drawn to a shaded corner near the crypt door. The stones there were older, worn smooth by centuries of weather and footsteps. With careful fingers, she traced the edges of several flagstones. One seemed looser than the rest. Summoning her strength, she lifted it aside to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The hidden passage beneath St. Martin's Church was no longer legend, it was a reality. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, feeling the weight of history and mystery pressing upon her. The secret beneath the church was beginning to reveal itself, and with it, the threads of Mrs. Penrose's death. The dim light of dawn crept through the windows of Miss Marple's modest cottage, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor. The village of Little Hemsby stirred slowly, but Jane Marple was already awake, her mind alight with the revelations of the previous day. The secret passage beneath St. Martin's Church had shifted the mystery into new, uncharted territory. What lay hidden in those ancient tunnels could hold the key to the truth about Mrs. Penrose's death. Miss Marple's day began with quiet deliberation. She spent the early hours reviewing her notes and piecing together the fragments of the tangled web she had been unraveling. The list of suspects was longer than ever, their motives intertwined with the hidden secrets beneath the churchyard. As the morning mist lifted, she made her way back to the church, determined to explore the newly discovered cryptic passage further. Before entering, she sought out Inspector Finch, who was coordinating the investigation at the rectory. "Inspector," she said, "I believe we are close to the heart of this mystery. May I suggest a course of action?" Finch, accustomed to her subtle guidance, nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. What do you propose?" She explained her intention to visit the suspects again, engaging them in conversation to observe their reactions and unearth any hidden truths. Sometimes, people reveal more in their mannerisms and choice of words than in direct answers. Finch smiled faintly. "A psychological game." "Precisely." Her first visit was to Mr. Thomas Peters, the parish council member whose sharp disagreements with Mrs. Penrose had placed him under suspicion. She found him in his study, poring over parish documents with a tense expression. "Mr. Peters," she began gently, "may I ask how you have been coping with recent events?" Peters looked up sharply. "It's been difficult, Miss Marple. Mrs. Penrose's accusations weighed heavily, but I stand by my decisions." "Regarding the land sale and the renovations?" "Absolutely. The village's future depends on progress, not clinging to the past." Miss Marple watched as a flicker of unease crossed his face when she mentioned the passage beneath the church. "You are aware of its discovery?" "Yes," Peters admitted, voice tightening. "A distraction from real issues, if you ask me." She smiled serenely. Distractions sometimes reveal the truth people wish to hide. Leaving Peters, she next sought Leonard Sims, the schoolteacher. His nervous energy was palpable when she arrived. "Mr. Sims," she said warmly, "I wonder if you might help clarify something." He swallowed and nodded. "Of course. Your presence near the vicarage on the night of the break, would you mind explaining again?" Leonard's eyes darted about. I was walking home, but I assure you I saw nothing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you. And have you any knowledge of aconitine? It is a rare poison." He hesitated. I've read about it in botany books. It's toxic, but I've never handled it." Her gaze lingered, noting the subtle tension in his voice. Later, Miss Marple visited Edmund Carver. The vicar's assistant received her with polite reserve. "Mr. Carver," she began, "I understand you were preparing for Sunday's service on the evening of Mrs. Penrose's death." "Yes," Edmund replied. "I was alone most of the evening." "Did you notice anyone near the churchyard? Any unusual visitors?" "No," he answered firmly. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "Yet the break-in at the vicarage suggests otherwise." Edmund's composure flickered momentarily. "I can only speculate." Her final visit was to Reverend Harcourt, who welcomed her into his study, now more orderly since the break-in. "Reverend," she said gently, "how do you view the village's current state?" He sighed. "Fractured. Distrust runs deep. Do you have faith the truth will emerge? I hope so, he replied. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Mrs. Penrose's death has unveiled much, but perhaps more remains hidden. With the visits complete, Miss Marple returned to the churchyard, where she took a seat on a stone bench near the crypt's entrance. She watched as villagers passed by, their faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. It was time for her final test, a subtle psychological game to watch for reactions that might expose guilt or reveal concealed knowledge. That evening, Miss Marple arranged a small gathering in the rectory's garden, inviting key villagers under the pretense of a casual social evening. The air was crisp, and lanterns cast warm pools of light over the assembled group. She engaged each guest in light conversation, carefully weaving in references to the passage beneath the church, Mrs. Penrose's concerns, and the recent disputes. Her words were gentle probes, designed to unsettle and observe. When Mr. Peters heard her mention the hidden passage, his face flushed, and he excused himself abruptly. Leonard Sims became unusually quiet when the topic of aconitine arose, avoiding eye contact. Edmund Carver appeared calm but subtly stiffened when Miss Marple spoke of the break-in. Reverend Harcourt's gaze grew distant, and he glanced away when the church land sale was mentioned. Throughout, Miss Marple observed keenly, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. After the guests departed, she sat alone beneath the stars, piecing together their reactions. Each subtle shift, each evasive glance, and each abrupt exit spoke volumes. The shadows beneath St. Martin's Church were closing in on the truth. Miss Marple smiled softly, her final test complete. The true story was within reach, ready to be unveiled. Chapter 5. The Reveal. The village of Little Hemsby seemed quieter than usual the morning after Miss Marple's subtle gathering at the rectory garden. The air hung heavy, as if the very stones of St. Martin's Church were holding their breath, awaiting the moment when truth would finally be set free. Miss Marple herself sat by the window of her modest cottage, calmly sipping her morning tea, yet her mind was alive with clarity, each fragment of the mystery settling neatly into place. She had watched the villagers' reactions carefully the previous evening, the flushed cheeks, the sudden silences, the swift departures. Each told a story, a confession in disguise. Now it was time to bring those whispered secrets into the light. Miss Marple began her day by sending discreet invitations to the key suspects and involved parties: Mr. Thomas Peters, Leonard Sims, Edmund Carver, Reverend Harcourt, Mrs. Agnes Mallory, and Inspector Finch. They were to meet her in the rectory's library at midday, a neutral ground where she would gently but firmly unravel the web. When the guests gathered, tension was palpable but masked by polite conversation. Miss Marple greeted them with her characteristic warmth. "Thank you all for coming," she said softly. "We have had a trying time in our village, and I believe it is time for us to piece together what has truly transpired." She paused, letting her gaze rest briefly on each face before continuing. Mrs. Gladys Penrose was a woman devoted to this village, but she carried knowledge that made her dangerous to some. Her death was no accident, but the result of careful planning, poisoned by aconitine, a rare and potent toxin. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. "First," Miss Marple said, "let us consider the motive." Mrs. Penrose opposed the sale of the church land, a matter fiercely contested by the parish council, notably Mr. Peters, who saw the sale as essential for the village's finances. She looked directly at Peters, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Then there was the hidden passage beneath the church," she continued, "discovered recently but long suspected. It contained records and relics, some suggesting irregularities in the management of church funds." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she turned to Reverend Harcourt. The vicar was understandably troubled by these revelations, fearing the village's peace would be shattered. The Reverend nodded silently. "But the truth lies not only in motives but in opportunity and subtle human nature," she said. Turning to Leonard Sims, Miss Marple said gently, "Mr. Sims, you are knowledgeable about botany, including poisons like aconitine. You claim to have no access, yet the toxin found in Mrs. Penrose's system suggests otherwise." Leonard's face paled and he glanced down. "And Mr. Carver," Miss Marple continued, Your calm exterior belies a complicated position. Your recent disagreement with Reverend Harcourt and your closeness to the council gave you access to many of the documents and locations involved. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more. The break-in at the vicarage was intended to retrieve or destroy documents Mrs. Penrose might have used as leverage. The residue found on the churchyard well's iron handle was a means to administer the poison covertly, something only someone familiar with the church's grounds would know. She allowed the weight of this to settle. It was a carefully crafted plan to silence a woman who threatened to expose long-held secrets. A slow nod came from Inspector Finch, who had been listening intently. "Now, the final piece," Miss Marple said quietly. "At my gathering last night, each of you revealed yourself in ways you could not control. Mr. Peters's abrupt departure, Mr. Sims's nervousness, Mr. Carver's tension, all these signs pointed toward guilt and complicity." Her voice grew firmer. "Yet, the true architect of this crime is someone whose desire to protect the village's future blinded them to the value of honesty and human kindness." She turned sharply to Mr. Peters. "It was you who acquired the poison and planned the murder to prevent Mrs. Penrose from revealing the mismanagement of church funds and opposing your land sale." Peters's face twisted with a mixture of anger and defeat. "I did what was necessary," he spat, "for the good of the village." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The good of the village cannot be built on lies and death." Inspector Finch stepped forward, placing Peters under arrest as the room held its collective breath. Mrs. Mallory exhaled softly. "Justice has finally been served." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "The village will heal, though scars remain." As the others left, she lingered by the window, reflecting on human nature's complexities, the lengths people go to protect what they hold dear, and the quiet courage it takes to seek truth beneath shadows. The secret beneath St. Martin's Church was finally unveiled, but the story of Little Hemsby would echo for many years, a reminder that even the most peaceful places hold mysteries waiting to be discovered. The village of Little Hemsby awoke the morning after Mr. Thomas Peters' arrest to a quiet that felt almost unnatural. The usual hum of daily life, the clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps, the soft chatter at the market, the distant crowing of roosters, was tempered by an undercurrent of uneasy reflection. The peaceful rhythms of the village had been disrupted, and although the truth had been unveiled, the echoes of the tragedy lingered. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the soft morning light filtering through lace curtains and casting delicate patterns across her tidy sitting room. She sipped a cup of tea with the unhurried grace of one who had long learned to live with the shadows alongside the light. Her sharp eyes, however, revealed the thoughtful mind beneath, weaving together the threads of recent events. The arrest of Mr. Peters had been both a relief and a shock. For many, it was hard to reconcile the man who had been a pillar of the parish council with the dark act he had committed. Yet, as Miss Marple knew, the true face of human nature was rarely simple. News traveled swiftly, and by midday, the village square was filled with villagers exchanging subdued words. Some expressed gratitude for justice, others whispered regrets that the fracture in their community had deepened. Miss Marple's old friend, Mrs. Agnes Mallory, approached her with a tired smile. "Jane," she said softly, "it's a strange peace that follows such revelations." "It is, Agnes," Miss Marple replied. "The village will heal, but it will take time." "Do you think the worst is truly over?" Miss Marple considered this. "For now, yes. But the wounds beneath the surface may yet take years to fade." Throughout the day, villagers who had once been divided found themselves drawn together in small gestures, sharing tea, offering quiet apologies, tending to Mrs. Penrose's neglected garden. The tragedy had reminded them of their shared humanity, the fragile bonds that held their community together. Miss Marple herself visited the churchyard, now peaceful beneath a pale afternoon sky. The crypt's iron door was securely closed, and the well's iron handle gleamed clean, its secret no longer hidden. She paused beside Mrs. Penrose's grave, a simple headstone adorned with fresh flowers. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves as Miss Marple placed a single rose upon the earth. "Rest now, Mrs. Penrose," she whispered. "Your courage brought truth to light." Later, She met with Inspector Finch at the rectory, where they discussed the ongoing inquiries. "Jane," Finch said, "your insight was invaluable. Without you, this case might have remained unsolved." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "The village has its stories, Inspector. Sometimes, one must listen closely to hear them." Finch nodded. "And sometimes the smallest clues make the greatest difference." As evening fell, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts drifting to the nature of justice and forgiveness. The village had been shaken, yet it endured, shaped by the resilience of its people and the enduring strength of community. She settled into her favorite chair by the fire, knitting quietly as the soft glow illuminated her serene face. The mystery had unfolded as she had suspected, a tale woven not just with deceit and tragedy but with the complexities of human nature. Outside, the stars began to twinkle over Little Hemsby, casting their gentle light on St. Martin's Church and the village below. The secret beneath the church had been unearthed, but life continued, ever moving forward. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, content in the knowledge that, for now, the shadows had lifted, and the village could begin to heal. Chapter 6. Echoes Beneath the Surface. The weeks that followed the revelation of Mr. Peter's guilt and the unmasking of the sinister events beneath St. Martin's Church brought a fragile calm to Little Hemsby. Yet, beneath this outward peace, the village carried the echoes of its recent ordeal like faint tremors beneath still waters, soft, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Miss Marple moved through the village as she always did, her keen eyes catching the smallest shifts in mood and manner. She noted how some villagers spoke less openly now, their smiles more guarded. Others avoided certain streets or faces as if hoping to sidestep unspoken questions. One afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Agnes Mallory, who had invited her for tea at her ivy-clad cottage on the village edge. "Jane," Agnes began, pouring steaming tea into delicate china cups, "the village is healing, but it is clear not all wounds have closed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. When secrets are rooted so deeply, it is often generations before their scars fade. Agnes sipped her tea. "You've always had a way of seeing what others miss. I wonder, did we truly understand the full story behind Mrs. Penrose's courage? Or even Mr. Peter's desperation? That is the nature of humanity," Miss Marple said gently. "Few acts are simply good or evil. They are shaped by fear, hope, and sometimes a misplaced sense of duty." Their conversation drifted toward the church itself. Agnes mentioned a rumor she had heard, of a letter, penned decades ago, hidden within the crypt's walls, speaking of a secret pact made by village elders. The letter, some claimed, hinted at a betrayal far older than any recent disputes. Miss Marple listened intently. Such stories often grow with time, but they remind us that the past never fully leaves us. Later that week, Miss Marple called upon Reverend Harcourt, who was quietly rebuilding the parish's trust. They walked together through the now peaceful churchyard, the afternoon light warming the stone crosses and swaying grass. "Jane," the Reverend confessed, "this tragedy has changed me. It revealed how much the church is intertwined with the lives and secrets of this village." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It is often through darkness that we see the light more clearly." Before leaving, she asked, "Do you feel the village is ready to move forward?" Harcourt paused. "I believe so. But some questions may linger longer than we expect." Across the village, Leonard Sims returned to his teaching with a quieter demeanor. The schoolchildren noticed his gentler tone, less distracted by the tensions that had clouded his thoughts. Yet Miss Marple saw in him the marks of remorse and contemplation, a man changed by the weight of the recent revelations. In the evenings, Miss Marple often sat by her window, the soft glow of lamplight casting a warm halo around her. She reflected on the intricate dance of human nature, how truth and deception, love and fear, so often entwined to create stories both tragic and redemptive. The shadow beneath St. Martin's Church had lifted, but she knew the village's history was layered and rich, with mysteries waiting patiently to be uncovered by those who dared to look closely. For now, Little Hemsby would breathe a little easier, but Miss Marple remained ever watchful, a quiet guardian of the delicate balance between light and shadow. The weeks since the arrest of Mr. Peters had settled into a fragile rhythm in Little Hemsby. Though outwardly calm, the village was like a pond with quiet ripples beneath the glassy surface. Movements felt but not always seen, subtle shifts in alliances and glances that lingered too long. Miss Marple, ever observant, moved with her usual unassuming grace, quietly noting the undercurrents that still flowed between the villagers. She had learned that even when a mystery was solved, its aftermath could unfold in unexpected ways. One crisp morning, she found herself walking along the narrow lane that led to the village school. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with wisps of white clouds, and the hedgerows were thick with wild roses. The scent of damp earth and blooming flowers lent a peacefulness that contrasted with the unsettled feelings she sensed among the villagers. At the school gates, Leonard Sims was speaking with a group of parents. His posture was more relaxed than before, though his eyes still held a trace of fatigue. Miss Marple approached, and he turned, offering a tentative smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted. "Thank you for your kindness during these difficult times." "You're managing admirably," she replied warmly. "How are the children adjusting?" "They're resilient," Leonard said, "though the adults may carry the burden longer." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes the smallest hands mend the largest breaks." As she continued, her thoughts drifted to the recent parish council meeting, which had been called to discuss the future of the church and the now quiet land dispute. The hall had been packed, the air thick with both hope and lingering distrust. Mrs. Agnes Mallory had spoken with quiet authority, urging reconciliation and the importance of remembering that the village's strength lay in its unity. Little Hemsby must move forward, she had said, not by forgetting the past but by learning from it. Miss Marple recalled how even Reverend Harcourt had seemed steadier, his words more measured as he outlined plans to restore both the church and the community's faith. Yet, despite these hopeful signs, Miss Marple sensed that some wounds still ached beneath the surface. That afternoon, she received a visitor, a young woman named Clara Jennings, who had brought news that stirred fresh questions. "Miss Marple," Clara said, settling nervously into a chair, "I've been researching the history of the church crypt, and I came across some old documents that might interest you." Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. "Please tell me more." Clara explained that among the parish archives, she had found references to a secret society dating back centuries. Local figures who had met beneath the church to protect village interests and, at times, settle disputes away from prying eyes. "The society was said to guard a hidden treasure," Clara said softly, "though no one knows exactly what it was." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The past has a way of leaving its imprint on the present." They agreed to explore the archives together, promising to tread carefully through the layers of history and myth. Later that evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk toward the churchyard. The setting sun cast long shadows across the gravestones, and the air was cool and still. She paused near Mrs. Penrose's grave, the fresh flowers wilting gently in the fading light. Her thoughts returned to the woman's quiet courage and the price she had paid. Nearby, a soft rustling drew her attention. A figure stepped from the shadows. It was Edmund Carver. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, inclining her head. They spoke softly of the village's future and the delicate process of healing. Edmund confessed his struggles with trust and the burden of secrets he had carried. "The church has always been a place of refuge," he said. "But it is also a keeper of secrets, some heavier than others." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Secrets, like shadows, may never fully disappear. But with light they lose their power." As they parted, she felt the weight of her role, not just as an observer, but as a gentle guardian of Little Hemsby's fragile peace. Returning home, Miss Marple sat by her window, the stars beginning to twinkle above the village rooftops. She knew that while the murder mystery was resolved, life's complexities would continue to ripple beneath the surface. And as always, she would watch and listen, ready for the next secret waiting patiently to be revealed. Chapter 7. Unsettled Shadows. The autumn air carried a cool crispness as it wound its way through the narrow lanes of Little Hemsby. Leaves, tinged with amber and gold, rustled beneath the careful footsteps of villagers who went about their daily business with a certain cautiousness. Though the major storm of the recent murder had passed, a subtle unsettledness lingered in the village's heart, as if the earth beneath St. Martin's Church still held a secret not yet fully told. Miss Marple walked slowly past familiar cottages, nodding to acquaintances whose smiles carried hints of worry or wistfulness. She carried with her a small satchel filled with notes, a book or two, and the remnants of a mid-morning biscuit from Mrs. Peck's bakery. Her mind, as always, was busy piecing together the finer threads of the village's tapestry. Her first stop was the village library, a cozy stone building warmed by a low fire and smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood. There she found Clara Jennings already engrossed in a bundle of faded parchments and ledgers. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "Morning, Miss Marple," Clara replied, looking up with a smile tinged by exhaustion. "I've found more references to the secret society we spoke about. It seems they operated not just beneath the church, but also had ties to prominent families in the village, families still living here today." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Any names of note?" Clara hesitated before producing a list. "Several, including the Graysons, the Malloris, and, interestingly, Mr. Peter's ancestors." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Old connections often weave through the present more tightly than one expects. Together, they pored over the documents, discovering references to clandestine meetings held in the crypt and coded correspondences warning of betrayals and the need for secrecy. As the afternoon light waned, Miss Marple left the library to visit Mrs. Agnes Mallory. The widow's cottage, nestled at the village's edge, was surrounded by a riot of late-blooming flowers and ancient oaks. Agnes greeted her with a knowing smile. "I hear you've been delving into old village secrets." "Only what the past reveals willingly," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair by the fire. "But it seems the foundations of Little Hemsby run deep with mysteries." They spoke at length about the society and the weight of legacy. Agnes shared stories of village elders who had sworn oaths to protect their forebears' secrets, sometimes at great personal cost. "Such burdens can breed both loyalty and enmity," Agnes said thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is why Mrs. Penrose was so fiercely protective." Miss Marple mused quietly, aware that the past and present were inseparable threads in the village's fabric. Later that evening, a message arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. An anonymous note slipped under her door. It read simply, "The past watches still. Trust no one too easily." The words sent a chill through her. Though the murder case was closed, she sensed that all was not yet settled. Her thoughts turned to Leonard Sims and Edmund Carver, both of whom had been tight-lipped and uneasy in recent days. Were their silences a shield for secrets too heavy to share? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Leonard under the guise of discussing village history. They met in the quiet garden behind the schoolhouse, where the fading light caught the last blossoms of the season. "Leonard," she began gently, "sometimes the truths we fear the most hold the key to peace." He looked at her, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "I have tried to keep things buried, Miss Marple, but the past has a way of clawing back." She nodded encouragingly. "Would you trust me with what you know?" He sighed deeply, the weight of his burden clear. "There are things about Mrs. Penrose's family, and about the society, that I have kept silent." As he spoke, Miss Marple listened carefully, piecing together hints of old alliances and betrayals, of promises made and broken. The night deepened around them, and though the shadows lengthened, Miss Marple felt the faintest glow of understanding. The mystery beneath St. Martin's Church was far from over. The chill of early evening settled over Little Hemsby as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind stirred by the conversation with Leonard Sims. The fragile trust he had begun to place in her hinted at truths tangled in the village's shadowed past, threads she was now determined to unravel. After a simple supper, she settled into her favorite armchair by the window, the flickering firelight casting gentle shadows that danced across the room. The village lay quiet beneath the gathering dusk, but within her, a quiet storm of thoughts brewed. The next morning, Miss Marple decided it was time to confront Edmund Carver. His role as the vicar's assistant, coupled with his reticence and connection to the parish council, made him a crucial figure in the puzzle. She found him in the churchyard, tending to the garden with meticulous care, the solemnity of the ancient stones framing their meeting. "Good morning, Edmund," she began, her voice gentle yet purposeful. "Miss Marple," he responded, standing straight, though a shadow flickered behind his calm gaze. "I hoped you would call." "I have been speaking with Leonard," she said softly. "He has shared some concerns about the past, about secrets some have tried to bury." Edmund's fingers tightened briefly on the pruning shears before he answered. "The past is heavy here, Jane. Sometimes the weight is too much." "Did Mrs. Penrose carry that weight alone?" Miss Marple asked. He looked away, his expression guarded. "She knew things that unsettled the council, that threatened the delicate balance of our community. Was she planning to reveal them?" Miss Marple pressed. Edmund hesitated. She intended to confront certain members, to bring to light misdeeds hidden behind piety. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. That would explain the desperation that led to her death. The conversation lingered in the autumn air, both aware that more remained unspoken. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the village archives with Clara Jennings. Together they sifted through brittle papers and faded letters, uncovering records that spoke of clandestine meetings and whispered promises. A letter from decades past detailed a pact among village leaders to protect their interests, even at the cost of silence and sacrifice. "This explains much," Clara murmured. "The fear, the secrecy." Miss Marple nodded. "And why Mrs. Penrose's courage was so dangerous." That evening, Miss Marple convened a small gathering at her cottage, inviting Leonard, Clara, and Mrs. Mallory. The flickering candlelight cast a warm glow as they shared their findings and pieced together a narrative that stretched across generations. The room brimmed with unspoken questions, tentative alliances, and the slow unfolding of truths long concealed. As the night deepened, Miss Marple felt the weight of her role, to be both seeker and keeper of secrets, to navigate the delicate balance between justice and compassion. She knew the final revelations were close, but also that the village's peace would never be quite the same. The shadow beneath St. Martin's Church had been lifted, yet its echoes would shape Little Hemsby's future in ways both subtle and profound. Chapter 8. The Final Thread. The first frost of the season glistened on the hedgerows as dawn broke over Little Hemsby, painting the village in a fragile lace of silver. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying with it the unmistakable stillness of resolution, a quiet punctuation to the tumultuous days that had woven a complex tapestry of secrets, lies, and revelations beneath the venerable stones of St. Martin's Church. Miss Marple sat quietly at her breakfast table, her hands folded around a warm cup of tea. Outside the window, the village slowly came to life, unaware of the final truths poised to emerge. She felt a calm certainty settle over her, the gentle weight of a mystery nearing its close. Today, she would gather those involved one last time. There was still one thread left to follow, the subtle ties that bound past and present, which if pulled, would unravel the last concealments and lay bare the full story. By mid-morning, the rectory's library filled once again with familiar faces. Leonard Sims, his expression measured but wary, Clara Jennings, quietly attentive, Mrs. Agnes Mallory, dignified and resolute, Edmund Carver, composed but with a shadow in his eyes, Reverend Harcourt, solemn yet hopeful, and of course Inspector Finch, ever the embodiment of steady justice. Miss Marple began softly, "The past has long held its secrets close here in Little Hemsby. We have uncovered much, the poison that ended Mrs. Penrose's life, the disputes over the church land, the hidden passages beneath the stones, and the secret society whose influence stretched beyond generations." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "But there is one final truth that must be told, a truth about trust, betrayal, and the choices we make when the lines between right and wrong blur." Her eyes met Edmund Carver's. "Edmund," she said gently, "your presence here has been both a comfort and a mystery. Your loyalties were questioned, your reticence noted. But there is more to your story, is there not?" Edmund's gaze faltered briefly before he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with remorse. "I have tried to protect this village, its people, and its heritage. I was once part of that secret society, sworn to guard its interests. But as time passed, I saw how those oaths led to darkness, to silencing voices like Mrs. Penrose's. He took a deep breath. I knew of the poison, the plans to stop her. I tried to intervene but was too late. My silence has been my burden. The room was silent but for the ticking of the old clock. Miss Marple nodded, her voice calm but firm. Truth is the only path to healing, Edmund. Your courage in confessing now helps lift the shadow that has loomed for so long. She turned to the others. Mrs. Penrose was not merely a victim of a crime but a symbol of resistance against the forces that sought to control little Hemsby's future through fear and secrecy. The group exchanged looks, some tinged with regret, others with relief. Inspector Finch stepped forward. This confession helps us understand the full extent of what happened. Justice will follow, tempered by mercy and the complexities of human nature. Miss Marple concluded, and for the village, the road ahead is one of rebuilding trust, embracing openness, and remembering that every shadow is dispelled by the light we choose to shine. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the sun rise higher, casting golden hues over the ancient church and the village it guarded. Her thoughts were with Mrs. Penrose, whose courage had kindled the search for truth, and with little Hemsby, whose future now shimmered with fragile hope. The final thread had been pulled, the story completed, but the gentle, enduring mystery of human nature would continue to unfold, as it always did, in the hearts of those who lived beneath the shadows and the light.